So welcome to our session, part of our conversation sessions around the Health and Social Care Partnership Strategic Plan. Nice to have you all here. I am Sheena Arthur and I'm Partnership Manager at Glasgow Council for the voluntary sector, and my role is working within health and social care and very much about working together with our health and social care partnerships, connecting, looking at improvements and how we work better together. So really delighted. This is the second of our events that we're hosting with our colleagues to look at engagement around the strategic plan. And please make yourself comfortable with the Zoom. I appreciate some people aren't used to using Zoom, but there should be a little box at the bottom for chat. Some of you are using it already. Thank you for that. And there will be time for discussion and questions, so you won't be muted the whole time. We really want this to be a conversation, and colleagues at the partnership are really keen that that's what this is about. It's about coming together, learning about what's working well, what the challenges are, what should be in that plan. And I was thinking about this earlier about colleagues coming and our HSCP colleagues coming and thinking, well, that's great because it's their plan. And I thought, well, no, we want it to be our plan. That's the really what we're aiming for, that we all understand our role within this plan, and that we really see the value and the contribution of the third sector in that plan. So no pressure, Craig, that's the aim for this plan for the future. So I am going to hand over. We have Ian Bruce, our Chief Exec at GCVS, who is joining us to talk about the Better Relationships Review. And we also have Mike Burns, who's joining us, who I shall introduce later. But thank you so much for your time and for everyone that's here today. So I am going to hand over to Ian. Thank you.
Thanks, Sheena, and it's so good to see people here today. I wanted to say a few words to kick us off today around the Better Relationships, Better Outcomes process that we have been working through with our public sector colleagues across the city. Obviously, as Sheena's alluded to, one of the things that we're really hopeful of seeing in the strategic plan is a much clearer steer around the opportunities for third sector and public sector collaboration and improving outcomes in the health and well-being of citizens in the city. And that principle really sat at the core of the Better Relationships work that's been done over the last year, just over a year now, in the city. So the Better Relationships process, for those that aren't aware of it, was started by the Social Recovery Task Force that Glasgow City Community Planning Partnership set up in the aftermath of COVID and the original outbreak, with the intention of looking at some of the key issues in the city that we needed to address if we were really going to start to shift outcomes for people and the citizens of the city. And that looked at a whole range of different issues around people with disabilities and, BME people, I hope women, whole range of areas, and also at issues like poverty and digital exclusion in the city. But the strand that obviously we had a particular interest in was around that fundamental underlying issue of the relationships between the third sector and the public sector in the city. And it's fair to say, I think, that over a number of years, those relationships have had their ups and downs. And for many organizations in the third sector, the relationship that they have with public bodies is really critical in terms of their ability to achieve the outcomes that they're looking to achieve. But equally, I think what COVID demonstrated more than anything before is that actually the third sector good relationships with the third sector is really critical for the public sector to be able to achieve the outcomes that it wants to achieve for citizens. And I think I hope we can all agree that actually what both sectors are aspire to do is to achieve the best outcome for people and for communities in the city. So the Better Relationships group was formed from 12 12 nominees from the third sector. It was an open process. We went out and asked people to put themselves forward and identified a grouping of people who represented the diversity of the sector in the city. And that group spent quite a lot of time looking at all of the issues that reflected, that had an impact, if you like, upon the quality of the relationship that the sector has with the public sector. And that stretched from the very high level issues around values, power dynamics, to really practical day-to-day issues around the challenges, and I think it's fair to say the challenges that both sectors have around issues like procurement and how that works. So the group identified a series of recommendations, just under 50 recommendations, covering, as I said, values and power dynamics, community empowerment, funding, representation of the sector, how we communicate and understand each other better, procurement, and accountability and implementation. And for those that haven't seen it, there is a draft report on the GCVS website that outlines those recommendations. And I totally meant to have the link ready so that I could just hit enter at that point, but managed to copy and paste it relatively easily. So if anyone hasn't seen that report, please do have a look at it. We tried, it covers quite a lot, but we tried to keep it as succinct as possible. The next stage of that report went back to community planning. It was recognised by community planning as being consistent, and reasonable. And we're now in a stage where we are working with partners across the public sector, and that includes Craig's colleague Alison, and others from the HSCP, as well as senior officers from the council, and ALIOs as well in the city, the arm's length external organisations, Glasgow Life, etc., to look at how we implement those recommendations, because some of them are really easy in a sense. They're motherhood and apple pie, but actually their implementation takes effort, and it takes a sustained plan to be able to deliver. So that's where that process is at. That group is meeting monthly at the moment and turning the recommendations into an action plan. And what's quite interesting as we've been going is that actually some of the recommendations we've been able to kind of start moving on pretty quickly, and many colleagues will be aware of the Glasgow Community Fund phase 2, which launches hopefully very soon. It goes to committee later this month, and we were able to take some of the principles that came out of that and move things a little bit in regard to Glasgow Community Fund phase 2. So some of the principles and the things that the sector said to us during that, we have managed to speak to colleagues in the council and shift that a little bit. So that's where we are. I'm not going to go through all of the recommendations and all of the actions. I don't think that's a good use of time today. But the really high level is about recognizing that actually a lot of the barriers between our sectors are unintended consequences of well-intentioned decisions. And actually sometimes what we need to do is shift the thinking a little bit there. Some colleagues will be well aware about my hammering on constantly around things like procurement and that sense that I routinely get from third sector organisations and indeed some public sector colleagues, that procurement isn't working as well as it should for the city. It's not fast enough to get money out the door when it's needed. It's not robust enough to understand the issues on the ground. And how do we start to do something a little bit different? And I'm really hopeful that the Better Relationships Group, and indeed thinking about things like the strategy, are an opportunity to do that. I'm not going to talk any more about the Better Relationships, but I am happy to take a couple of questions if folk have any, or better still, we might be better giving Mike some time to talk, because I think some of the principles around what children's services in the city have been trying to do really speak to me around the principles of better relationships. Not that Not that things are perfect in children's services, I'm sure Mike would agree, but actually that some of what's been tried is seeking to go in the direction that we're outlining. I don't see any hands for questions, so I'm going to go back to you, Sinead, and you can introduce Mike.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Thanks much. So people may well be thinking about questions, and please do put your questions in the chat. We'll have time afterwards to take questions and discussion before we go into the breakout rooms. So thank you for that overview, Ian, and of our Better Relationships work, and delighted that Mike Burns, not Fire Tablet, Mike Burns is here, Assistant Chief Officer from Glasgow City Health and Social Care Partnership within Children's Services. But as Ian says, the focus for today is around the relationships, the learning, and really delighted that Mike is here to share the learning that has come from the work of himself and his team within Children's Services. So thank you very much for your time and sharing, Mike, and over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sheena. Thank you for that intro. I think obviously what I was keen to do today in terms of the slides was really to focus in on that whole system reform, and I think pick up the issue that Ian had talked about better relationships, but those better relationships being fundamentally about better outcomes and about improving outcomes. And I think once we are, in a sense, sharply focused in on what matters to children, what matters to young people, then I think that can drive a transformational change and can drive a conversation that's very different. If you can move to slide 1, we obviously recognised 6-7 years ago the need to really kind of focus in on delivering the Christie Commission and moving from failure demand, but also to pick up that point that's been raised about really being kind of focused in on outcomes and making sure that getting it right for every child was aligned to anti-poverty, and to recognise family as being the most important infrastructure in the city. I'm just wondering if you can go to slide 1 and then move on. Who's ever? Because in terms of looking at slide 1, one of the things that we wanted to focus in on was about family is the most important infrastructure and parenting is the most important infrastructure. Then we need to recognise the voice of families, we need to recognise the voice of neighbourhoods, and we do need to then recognise the voice of everybody.
Oh. I think I might have lost Mike. Yeah.
Have we got someone within the team that can maybe pick this up?
I think just give him a couple of minutes to come back on. I'm sure he'll be, if we can. I mean, if anyone's sitting with a burning question about the better relationships process, I'm happy to go back to that if it's a good use of time. Hopefully. Yeah. Dangers of technology.
Yeah. When you were talking, Ian, I know I get a chance to ask you questions all the time, but just for people's interest, I guess a key point that came up for me was how we implement those recommendations from the review. And there is the working group now, isn't there, who are looking at those recommendations to try to put them into practical actions?
Yeah, so there's a working group, and that working group is made up of some of the original third sector organisations that were involved, and then quite senior leaders from across the public sector as well. So that's really helpful to have that senior buy-in, and the process has been on the agenda a couple of times at the council management team, which is the chief executive of the council and the director of the council and the chief executive of the ALIOs and the HSCP. So we've got that buy-in, which I think is really critical. And I'm aware that some in the sector will be cynical about change, but I think what we have is a really good opportunity. Not, and I suppose the other bit I'll say is we're never going to get it perfect.
Yeah.
You know, it's a journey about making things better year on year for everybody. But Mike appears to be back. Mike, welcome back. Technology failing us. Pretty sure Lynn is about to get your slides on there. If you're able to come back in. Technology is just not being fun for us. Mike, if you're speaking, you're on mute.
When you're talking there about values, Ian, I'm thinking about our work within maximising independence and the work that colleagues, Marion's leading that in our comms and engagement work around the values, but we've been having lots of conversations about the values are great, but is that change you're talking about in the buy-in, the behaviour, what does it mean? What does that value mean in terms of our practice, and what are our expectations of what's going to be different? And I'm encouraged that we're having those conversations and that they're happening across the different strands of work.
Sorry, Sheena, Mike's phoning me. Apologies.
Okay.
I've got a quick question. It's about accessibility to key people, because I think my name's Jenny, by the way. Can you hear me?
Hi, Jenny. Hi,
Yeah.
Jenny from GamCare.
From GamCare, yeah. We provide support around raising awareness of gambling and stuff like that. No, it's just about accessibility of key people and how that's going to work, because I think in terms of like with the pandemic, and you know, we've got a real shift in the way that different departments work, how councils work, and it feels in some ways it's great when we're having online meetings. It can be a lot more accessible in that respect, but in terms of everyday life and communities having access to people, it feels that's where there's a gap. And how is that going to work, and ensuring that the community isn't disconnected with the public sector and their local communities as well? So how do we bridge that gap? I think that's one of the things I don't know if that's the right question to ask, but it's just something I just looked at the recommendations. So
there's no right or wrong questions, Jenny. Thank you for coming in. I think that's sorry, Ian's appeared. Am I okay just to carry on? Yep.
Yeah, I heard Jenny asking a question, Sheena, but I was on the phone to Mike to try and get
that's okay.
And he is now in. But if Jenny, if you can put your question or your comment in the chat, I'll respond to it if that's all right, and we'll let Mike get on with his presentation while he's connected.
Okay,
that's fine. Just if Mike goes ahead, my question can wait for later. That's no problem.
Okay, thanks Jenny.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Mike.
Okay. Ian, you want me to pick up again?
Yeah, just on you go, Mike. Thank you.
Okay. So I just think the issue in and around kind of connecting into better relationships, better partnerships with families, but better partnerships across all services. And one of the things that we've reflected on has been about the clarity of vision, about the fact that we've been doing this work since 2015. Doesn't feel like that, but that dialogue and that reflection and that analysis has come out of a lot of the work that we've done with Celsius in relation to being curious about our assumptions and trying to move from beliefs and biased to recognising the importance of not just agreement, but about consensus, where we see consensus at times being a red flag, and being the really important thing is to make sure that there is debate and there is a direction to travel that we can understand. And it is about reflecting on the feedback from everybody over the course of the services that were provided, the current historical inquiry, you know, feedback and really still things like even long lost families, but also 65% of kids in Glasgow go home. And that's one of the things that we've needed to think about, is to reflect on all feedback being a gift, all feedback, all complaints, all reflections, trying to move a lot of young people into being trusted advisors for us. So recognising that getting it right for every child is about getting it right with every partnership, with every provider, with every parent. And I think one of the things that we've tried to look at deeper and we've tried to chat to Ian about is about where power lies. And I think Ian picked up the same point about shifting the thinking, is that the barriers in the engagement are not the challenges of children and families, are not the challenges of parents, they're our challenge. And those are some of the things that we need to talk about. Next slide. In terms of focusing in on the alignment of the HSCP system with the third sector, we've tried to do that through a much more focus in on poverty, but also recognising the Winter Social Protection Fund. We also, through the single plan for children's services, managed to incorporate 1,325 voices. And we did a recent questionnaire of that Winter Social Protection Fund money that went to families, and they gave us 442 feedback. When you go into the family support, we did that with 80 families. So you're basically talking about the voicing nearly enough 2,000 people within the city, which is really important when you're then talking about shifting that complex multi-system to a single system. Easily said, but very difficult to do. Talking about partnerships, which aren't just about HSCP to adults, but to education, to police, to everybody being part of transforming those roles, reframing the problem, and recognising the need for greater early help and prevention. Next slide, thanks. So one of the things that we've really kind of focused in on, Ian touched on it, is about family support, but critically that was co-produced with the third sector and 80 families. It wasn't, in a sense, consulted on. It was actually done together. And I think that's a really important part of the partnership that has been part of the success. And also that issue about alignment with the third sector in relation to even things like mental health. How do we connect up tier 1 and tier 2 in a way that's much more effective? Next slide. So part of the thing that we wanted to focus in on it, and again, it's critical at the moment, is about how we tackle the current cost of living crisis, but how we create that one integrated children's plan connected into the HSCP. I think Ian made the point, Sheena made it becoming our plan, I think is really, really important. The whole family wellbeing support at the moment is talking about our need to kind of change spend from that Christie failure demand to 5%. I think it needs to be even higher than that, 5, 8, 10% being towards prevention, so that we can get greater synergy, greater alignment, and we can really begin to kind of promote that system learning, because that's one of the things that I'll talk about in a minute when we look at the issue about practice and about the interaction, the kindness, the relationships that we build with families. We've got to collectively, whether you're in a teacher, whether you're in the third sector, we've got to do that together. One of the things that myself and Ian are looking at is about that cohesion and alignment of the preventative spend. So looking at the community planning money that's in children's services of about circa 21 million, connecting it into the health and social care partnership money, the whole family wellbeing fund we hope will come from government, but connecting it into mental health, the care experience, and the direct payments and kinship care. So we've got that aligned, coordinated, cohesive, and impact, a kind of solidarity of activity and work that we do together. Next slide. So I think part of the thing that we've wanted to look at is about how do we get greater alignment of funding the city transformation, creating a greater focus in on added value around poverty, but also recognising the need to do things in a much more public health appropriate way, which is about kind of how do we share learning, how do we operate as one system, and how do we operate where conditions are enabling rather than complex. If you go to the next slide, I won't go through all of these slides, but basically kind of saying we needed to kind of look at how we align funding through Scottish Government community funding, but also recognising on the right-hand side there the need for that point I'm making about greater consistency of high quality practice, seamless pathways, so that the way that we're working with families, again, going back to the bit, is it's no their challenge to get round all of the challenges of engaging with us, but actually something that we make as straightforward to them as possible. Next slide. So part of the thing that we've been looking at is a hypothesis, which is about saying, if our outcomes are we achieving, if they were clearer, if we were delivering GIRFECT more effectively, if we're delivering earlier intervention, we would be achieving better outcomes for kids. We would be less involved in social work, and that's a good thing. We would be actually diminishing that, and families would be experiencing a consistent, strength-based approach to intervention. Next slide. So one of the things that we've been working on really closely with Celsius is moving the kind of question about what do we do with what we've got to actually be much more bold, much more radical about what will it take to do what needs to be done. And this came from Herbert Force, who was an epidemiologist looking at eradicating smallpox. And that's one of the things that we've tried to do, is to say, if it's whole system and we need to take a whole system approach, then we need to operate and we need to have the capacity to deal and act as a whole system. We need those seamless pathways. We need strength-based, trauma-informed approaches that's coming, yes, from the 2,000 staff that deal with children's services, but also the 10,000 teachers, also the police officers, also the third sector, so that when we're interacting with families, we're giving them that flexibility of our support, and we are then effectively implementing GIRFECT. Next slide. So one of the things that we've tried to do is really kind of slow down, analyse the current system more effectively, but also to help the frontline practitioners. And we do work with Celsius that kind of focuses in on not just the strategy, not just the money, but actually on the day-to-day practice and the day-to-day interactions with families. Next slide. So one of the things that we've really tried to focus in on has been in and around strength-based aligned practice, but also to take an effective implementation approach to practice development. So one of the things that we've been trying to do is bring together all our really effective practice. Next slide. To focus in on, can we coach that? Can we train that? And can we select that so that what we bring to bear is a quality of competency drivers aligned with leadership and aligned to make sure that we can make the kind of radical change that we need to make. Next slide. So part of the thing about working in a side system away from a very much a child protection system, which kind of looked at, staff responding to risk, staff responding to the as-is system, risk-focused stories permeate the service, organisations change to adapt to that risk, bureaucratic processes, towards a much more system that's aligned to the promise, that's aligned to GIRFECT, that's aligned to families as experts in their own lives, promoting positive stories, focusing in on strengths and moving bureaucratic processes away so that we can deliver for families. And the next slide, just moving on, is examples of some of the alignment that we've done in relation to that transformational work, but obviously recognising the importance of continuing to go down the journey that we need to go down about focusing in on the promise, on brothers and sisters, but also learning about the framework around anti-poverty and about how we create that digital inclusion with communities, with children, with young people, with families, and also with the third sector. Next slide. So the challenges remain, and I'll try and sum up very quickly that we still see the fact that the challenges for post-COVID, post the aftershocks of COVID, are still about the fact that 80% of the kids that are on the register and in care come from the same neighbourhoods. And that one of the things that we need to look at is that those vulnerable neighbourhoods are disproportionately impacted. Next slide. But one of the things that we do want to emphasise is the shift that we've taken over those 6 7 years and the credit that we want to give to the third set families, the credit that we want to give to peers is 735. So you pandemic in March 2020, we had 965 kids in care. And at that point in time, we thought actually more children might come into care when in actual fact,
Have we lost Mike again?
To ask the same question. I was just thinking it settled down. Give him another couple of minutes. Apologies, folks. Can't get around technology.
No. Some key themes coming up across both those bits of work, and I heard Mike say quite a lot of alignment. I thought was interesting in terms of how we can try and connect the different bits of work that are happening and the funding, and that very much is coming up in the better relationships as well, isn't it, Ian, about funding and the different bits of work that are happening, how we pull them all together. Ian's the technical advisor. I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but there we go. But that's a key challenge, I think, and something that maybe you might pick up on in the discussions, because I see a lot of common themes with what Mike is saying. It's the how do we do that? You know, how do we work in a way that's trauma informed? And that's not just about everyone being trained in a trauma informed approach. It's how does that, what's the experience like for someone who gets in touch with a service or has a visit? And for those of you that work in this field, that comment from Mike around risk, I think is so important, moving from a risk-based focus to strength-based and seeing families as experts. But that's a huge shift for a lot of people. So how do we support that? And maybe people will have some shared learning. I was interested to hear when Mike's talking about effective practice, maybe what are the things that the team have picked out as being their own strengths. But I don't know if Mike's coming back in. Ian's off the phone, I think.
Yeah, I am, Sheena. So Mike phoned to say he was pretty much done. He did throw poor Dominique under the bus, who apparently is on the call. I'm struggling to see her actually, but apparently Dominique is on the call. So it was just, I think, Dominique, if you are, say so, and if there's anything that you would finish off with, but he was comfortable that he'd probably said the key things he wanted to say, but perhaps, I think you've already almost done it, is capture that summary of the key principles.
Okay.
Thanks,
Ian. I thought that was maybe Dominique coming in, but no. Okay, so
sorry, can I come in? I can't find my hand and my screen. It's Barry from HSCP. Yeah.
Oh,
sorry, I'm not pretending to speak for Mike, but I think the next slide, the one slide 18. So Mike was talking, it was slide 17 about the reduction in children that are coming into care. And in March 2020, when the pandemic started, we believe that that might increase over the period, but it's actually continued to fall, which we're really proud of at the slide. So for me, as a health background, as opposed to a social work background, slide 18 is really powerful to me, because an inadvertent, very positive consequence of the work that people have been doing within the HSCP is the fact that the amount of placements that children the placement moves that they have when they are within the care of the HSCP has reduced significantly over that period in time. And obviously, I don't need to tell you guys that for a child will be a huge step forward in terms of having their needs met and having that one safe adult. Going back to the trauma-informed approach around, is much more likely to happen if they're not having multiple placement moves. So that was all I wanted to say.
Thanks, Barry. Is that,
Yeah.
we'll be sharing the slide, will we, Lynn? Yeah,
Yeah.
great, thank you. Thank you, Lynn, for doing the slides and keeping us on track. Thanks, Barry. Is Dominique here that wants to come in, or?
So Dominique is on the call, is on the phone, Sheena.
Okay.
So she can come in and answer any questions if people have them off the back of that.
Okay, so we'll let people come in, use the chat or raise their hand if they have some questions. So yeah, just that alignment and how we actually move to a different way of working, I think is the challenge, but you might have some ideas about that to contribute in the discussion when you go into breakout rooms. Alison has her hand up. Hi Alison, how are you? You're on mute.
Mute.
That's you.
I was actually just saying I'm a newbie to Zoom. I've only been in a few, so trying to find everything is actually really quite difficult. It was just to come back on a couple of comments that you had made there, Sheena, in relation to alignment. Yeah, Mike does use the word alignment all the time in relation to service provision and to funding as well. And the stuff around funding, yeah, that has come up in the Better Relationships group, as Ian will be able to confirm. But we'll kind of, I suppose we'll never have a situation where everything works really seamlessly together in terms of funding, because of the kind of challenges you have in terms of where it comes from and that they don't align, and that some of it's short term. But that said, the discussions are ongoing about how can we actually try and do something around that. And actually, I can see Mike back on, so I'm going to come off now. Just to confirm that the points she raised were absolutely correct.
Thanks, Alison. And I think the fact we're having these discussions and trying to make things more aligned is
good.
what we
Absolutely.
want to see. It's following that through. Welcome back, Mike. You're darting about the virtual world today, but thank you for persevering, coming back in. Your team have contributed, but when you're here, if anyone has any questions or comments for either Ian or Mike, please do feel free. Thank you for that, Mike, for all that information. There's a lot for people to look at and maybe take in, and there might be questions to come, and we will always send out information after our events, and you're welcome to use the health and social care email box if there are any questions or comments later on that people think of. We've got a question coming in, have we? Yeah, so the learning, working with the third sector. Oh, sorry, David Stewart's got a hand up, so I'm going to come to David.
Hi, Sheena, thanks. And thanks, Mike, for that presentation. It was really interesting. I guess it's probably not a new question for you, but you're in a virtual room here with an abundance of partners that share your passion to make things better and to contribute and to alleviate a lot of the challenges that families and young people are facing. I guess the question just is, how can we support what you're doing? How can we get involved, and how can we look to work in partnership with you on a greater scale?
I think one of the things that we've been struck by is how, in a sense, aligned everybody is. That in actual fact, if we'd said 5-6 years ago that we were going to reduce children in care by 49%, by 670, whatever it was, we would have probably thought that was completely and utterly unrealistic. And we would have also thought that there might have been quite a degree of concern, risk an assistance to that about, is that the right thing to do? I think what's probably surprised us has been the degree to which people have been so supportive and so committed to that strength-based work. And I think one of the things that we probably recognise, David, is that everybody's out there making a contribution at the moment. It's as much, I suppose, picking up Ian's point, it's as much our job to partnership with you guys as it is for you guys to partnership with us. And one of the things that we've tried to do, going back to one of those points, is that we're still spending far too much money too late, and we're still spending far too much money outside the city. And we, you know, and I still feel really strongly and really passionately that we need to get that money, just as Ian's talked about, we need to get it into neighbourhoods, we need to get it into families, and we need to get it in a way that can actually make the impact that it can make to sustain children and young people in the community. So I think there's you know, we've probably done 5-7 years. I think what we've got to do collectively with this new plan is actually say what is the next, what can be radical and what can be achieved in the next 5 years. So thanks for that.
Thanks. Delighted we've got Susie, our colleague here, the lead for Everyone's Children. Susie, you can.
Hi, it was just to mention the new joint project that we're doing with the Health and Social Care Partnership, which is a collaboration between a number of third sector organisations and the Health and Social Care Partnership, which will be aiming to you know, consult children, young people and families about their needs, particularly their family support needs, you know, in the widest possible sense, and then involve them in co-designing and co-producing some new services that will meet their needs. Because I think this is at the heart of this, you know, transformational change of involving not just the third sector, but the people that we're providing service to, and listening to their views about the services, and also looking at new ways of procuring those services rather than the compulsory competitive tendering, which you know, puts us all in competition with one another, when we might be better collaborating to provide services. It's in its early stages at the moment, but you know, we hope that does some really good work over the next year, and it's something which is not confined to that very small group of organisations. On the steering group will be coming out much more widely to the to all organisations who work with children, young people and families, and asking if they can help to consult the people that they work with, and if those people are interested in getting involved in the co-design, co-production stage, to help support them to do that.
Great, thank you, Susie. And we're all going to be watching and learning from that work. No pressure, but I think there's going to be great learning across into adult and older people's services as well. So thank you for that, and we look forward to hearing about that. Jenny, I'd written down your question, but I see you've got your hand up, so you're welcome to come back in.
Thanks. Yeah, I just think it's amazing that less kids are in care. I just think that's a fantastic outcome, because I think probably more experts here than me, but children living in care, I mean, it can, you know, it's the drawbacks and the positives of it. But so I just want to acknowledge it. I think that's amazing. I just wondered about the lessons learned from COVID, because, you know, obviously there was quite an amazing kind of response within the community, and the voluntary sector was just absolutely incredible, and how that worked with local government. But the other side of that is what lessons can be learned, because during COVID, there was a lot of emergency legislations that were put in place and access to funding and stuff like that. And is there a recognition that, you know, this cost of living crisis actually might be a lot more harder hitting than what happened with COVID, and, you know, and how's that been taken into consideration? You know, what's the view in that, and what lessons do you think there is a limitation on the lessons that can be learned without those extra legislative emergency responses from the government?
Sheena, you want me to come back in?
Good, thank you, Mike. That would be great. That's
Yeah,
a lot of questions in one.
No,
So.
Sorry.
I took the note of them. They were really helpful. I think the point about the lessons learned from COVID was really important about the kind of humanitarian crisis and the need for a kind of approach to risk that I think has been part of the journey that we've been on, about saying we need to think about those longer term options. And I think that's one of the things that's really, really important, is that the outcomes for children and what mattered to children, I think, really needed to drive decision making. I think the bit in and around the emergency legislation, I think Ian's currently involved with conversation, as I am, with Anne-Marie O'Donnell, the Chief Exec, because I think Anne-Marie remains really keen to learn about what were the lessons about public sector reform and reform per se that we need to learn the lessons of. So I think the point you're making is really, really well made. And I think the issue about the cost of living crisis, again, really importantly, Anne-Marie O'Donnell saying that we need to respond to the cost of living crisis with the same concern and the same anxiety that we did at the beginning of the pandemic. But the pandemic affected everybody. The cost of living might not be the same. It's going disproportionately. And I think that's where a lot of the things that we've been working on in relation to anti-poverty, about structural inequality, are still going to have to be the drivers that determine the decisions that we take within HSCP and we take within the city.
Great, thanks, Mike. I'm going to hand over to Ian, who's going to come in on that point as well, and also to hand over chairing because I'm about to leave the session. But thank you so much for everyone for their contributions, and for my lovely team keeping us all in the room together. And I'm going to hand over to Ian. Thank you.
Thanks, Sheena. Yeah, I mean, Jenny, it's absolutely the right question, because I think we have lived. I go on and on. You know, it's 10 years since the Christie Commission. And what the Christie Commission told us was that we needed to be more local, we needed to be more asset-based, we needed to be more collaborative, we needed to be more preventative. And in many ways, and we needed to take risks. And in many ways, I look at the COVID response and I go, actually, we suddenly learned that lesson. We actually suddenly learned that lesson because the old way couldn't respond. The old way fell over. And so the new way, if you like, picked up. I worry a little bit that we forget the lesson really quickly, so that actually we start going back, and that we drift back into a world where we start to focus back on system can't cope. And that's really challenging around how we make sure we keep that. As Mike says, at a senior level, you know, a lot of the conversations are really positive, but there are endless practicalities, and you know, and Mike of all people probably knows, you know, because he's had a number of phone calls from me going, this isn't working, you know, this isn't working. You know, we have real examples of where at a strategic level we have a consensus that the right thing to do is X. It doesn't matter what it is, but actually the system resists. You know, the procurement system resists, the finance system resists, the governance system resists. And I think that's a real challenge for how we start to think in future. There's some bits in there, and it's not, you know, and I think we have to recognize in the third sector, we have to go, right, okay, we understand why these things are slow in the public sector. We understand why you cross every T and dot every I, because that's really critical. But actually the effect of it is stopping the change that needs to happen. And to an extent, and again, without being overly critical, we have had 10 years of Christie, and that's 10 years of being told what the change needs to be. And probably over that 10 years, it's a little bit like climate change. We haven't made that change quickly enough in the past. And I think we're now going to have to make that change faster in the future than we would like, because we didn't make the previous change faster before. And the longer we don't do it, the more painful it will be, both in the short term because we're not getting the right results, and in the long term because the change itself will be more painful. Linda.
Hello, thanks very much. Thanks for your presentation, Mike. My question is around the term you were using, alignment, and it touches on the points being raised already by some colleagues in the room around commissioning. How aligned do you think your ambition, especially in the family support strategy, which I think is highly ambitious, and you're going to need that to support your current trend of, you know, keeping children where they are safe and loved in their families. How well aligned is your commissioning processes in terms of, you know, the kind of direct hours, volume, capacity, and building contracts and the mechanics of contracts around that, rather than what you could say would be trusting relationships of the third sector?
A long way to go. A long way to go, Linda. I think would be fair to say. I don't think it is necessarily aligned in terms of the kind of professional social work or social policy element of it, and in terms of outcomes. So I would say that, you know, while government might be saying, right, we need to implement Christie, as Ian's saying, we need to save money at failure demand side, then we need to reinvest it. But that reinvesting it has also got a significant set of challenges behind it that we're all going to have to start working towards as a collective group. So I do think Ian's challenge on it in relation to, you know, flexibility, trust. If you look at the moment in local government, we're asking for greater trust from Scottish Government. We're asking for less ring fence, you know, funding. We're asking for funding to be flexible so that we can actually coordinate it in a way that actually then gives us a kind of a bigger impact. And I think we need to create that trust with the third sector. We need to be in the position, as Ian says, that we look at and we say, how do we do some of this business quickly, which is about better outcomes for children, quicker outcomes for children, than all the technical issues that, although important, and I'm not dismissing them, because I know this meeting's getting recorded and I wouldn't want to be, but I think fundamentally there is still a real disconnect between the opportunities with commissioning, and I know that Ian would say that there is maybe greater flexibility than where we are at the moment, but I do think we've got a journey to go on to get commissioning in Scotland nationally aligned to getting it right for every child and getting it aligned to the promise. And I think these are big challenges for the future.
Perfect. Thanks, Mike. I'm not going to encourage any more questions because I'm conscious of time, and actually a really critical part of today is hearing views from the sector and how that influences the strategic plan. So I'm going to move us into groups. I'll ask my colleague Lynn to move people into groups.